Okay, I think we can start, and as always, people will probably join later as well. We have some people on YouTube, so I guess we can start with the formal one. Welcome again, everyone, to the third in a series of webinars within the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behaviour in Cyberspace. This is a project that's run by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland in cooperation with the Geneva Internet Platform, UNIDIR, University of Lausanne, and the ETH in Zurich. Many of you have been following the webinars before, and you know a bit about that project, but I'll anyhow update you just quickly. The project runs from June this year. It's ending these days. This is this project within the number of online and in-situ events, bringing different institutions, provide a space for a dialogue between stakeholders, so representatives of the governments, private sector, and civil society and technical community, on what are the specific roles and responsibilities of these actors when it comes to cybersecurity, but particularly in context of international peace and security. It was a strong anchor to the results of the UN governmental group of experts as a sort of a basis, trying to see how each one of these stakeholders can contribute to the implementation of the UNGG norms, but also what might be other roles and responsibilities, including maybe shaping the future norms or other functions that are maybe not within the GG. A particular focus that we had also as sort of a case study during the Geneva discussion or the event in Geneva on 1st and 2nd of November was on critical infrastructure protection, because 3 of the GG norms are related to that. And this was sort of a test ground to see how different actors play on that, and we'll also touch upon that today. Today with us, as we discussed the role of the private sector in security and international peace and security, I have a great pleasure to introduce Martin Dion, who is here on behalf of with Kudelski Security, but he's also a lecturer in a number of universities and schools around the world. A person who is not viewing this discussion only from narrow perspective of cybersecurity, but quite wider, and I'm happy for that. So I'm sure we'll touch upon philosophy a little bit as well today. We'll jazz a little bit. We have some sort of an outline, but we actually want to hear from the private sector perspective, but as well from any one of you if you have any comments and thoughts. As usual within our webinars, you're most welcome to post comments at any point in the chat window. Natasha Peruchita is here to help us as a remote moderator. She'll help us feed the comments into our discussion. I'll get back to them regularly. And there's also a YouTube channel, so there is a number of people following the YouTube that probably have some questions as well, so we'll follow on that in the next 45 minutes or so. To start with, Martin, I guess there is no doubt that there is a huge role for private sector and the industry basically to be involved in this peace and security process when it comes to cybersecurity. There are many good examples or arguments why. One of those that you also mentioned in Geneva, that 95% of the infrastructure is actually owned by the private sector. So maybe the better question is to start with is why or how should the private sector be involved? And before that, I actually wanted to check with you. Private sector is not a coherent group, right? So there is a number of different players there. There is an IT industry, and even within the IT industry, you have different sectors, and then there is much beyond IT industry. So to start with, can you briefly maybe try to showcase what are the main components, main actors within the private sector, and what might be the different settings and even mindsets among them?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me today, and it's a very good question as well. It's something we touched based on at the Internet Governance Forum only a few weeks ago, actually. Generally speaking, right now, what's happening is everybody see the private sector as a monolithic group, and it's a huge mistake from a policy-making perspective for sure, but also from a governance perspective. But because effectively, what we have is, as you've mentioned, 3 at least three different set of actors or three bigger categories of actors. You can talk about the IT community, those who create those famous or infamous software, depending on how you see their role in creating this problem versus solving this problem. So the IT community, generally speaking, is working at a different pace and also have very different interests than most government would have. Part of the IT community obviously include all the larger companies who operate cloud softwares, or the Googles and the Amazon and the Apple and the Microsoft. Those are what I call the IT companies. Then you have the cybersecurity firms, which is a subset of the IT company. And the cybersecurity firms are probably the only one equipped with the adequate knowledge to effectively engage either with government or with civil society to improve the cybersecurity status. So on the one hand, we expect the IT community to create, let's say, safer product or more stable product or product that are more resilient. And on the other hand, we need to acknowledge that those products will fail at one point in time. Just like anything. I mean, a car, if you don't maintain it, eventually will fail. An information system is exactly the same thing. So it's not because you bought it last year that it should be perfectly safe and sound as of today. The pace of change in the world of IT is very different than the one you experience in your real life. Another point I talked about last week. And then you have those cybersecurity firms. The cybersecurity firms, in a way, they're like the garage. They are the guy who will actually maintain your car, or help you maintain your car, or provide options and things that you will put on your car to prevent it from rusting, some gas in the engine to allow it to run. So that's what the cybersecurity firms are about, if I have to draw an analogy with the classical world. But that's just a very small part of society. Although they represent a huge part of the stock market today, they're still a very small part of society. Government are much bigger employers. Less people work in IT than in almost any other sector, if you step back and you think about it, although technology is omnipresent. So that's one group. The second group you have is in the private sector, and you touched upon it also a few minutes ago, are the critical infrastructure providers. Critical infrastructure providers are, as you said, and as statistics demonstrate, are actually owned and operate up to 95% by the private sector. So it's not because it is a highway that it belongs to the government. Actually, if you look at many of the most important highways in North America, they actually belong to civil engineering companies. If you look at most airports in the world, they are in the end of the private sector as well. If you look at the banks, other than the national bank, who set the economic policies or actually enable the economic policy from a currency standpoint to flow between the various countries, effectively, the one you're dealing with as a person is a private player. Yes, he has a license, but basically he's a for-profit organization for sure. And that's the second group. And that group is consequent because that group touch food production, transportation, healthcare, energy, all sorts of services that our society need if it wants to be able to carry out with its day-to-day life. And if we step back and we think about some important writings in securing the states, when you look at it, the job of a government is to ensure eventually that the people can carry on with their life and with this feeling of being safe. That's the only way they can eventually reach happiness. If you feel unsafe systematically, there is no way that you will be happy from your government. It's simple as that. So how does the government ensure the safety and the security of critical infrastructure when those critical infrastructure actually belong to the private sector? And then the third group are the other company. The companies who are not tech companies, the companies who are creating maybe pharmaceutical products, companies who are offering all sorts of service, lawyers, the law firms, for example, libraries, bookstores, all those parties who exist and are part of our day-to-day life, and they are basically over 70% of our economy, if you think about it. If you remove the IT companies and the critical infrastructure companies, you're still left with 70% of enterprises that don't work in those sectors. And those 70% are critical as well because they are part of what we call the attack surface. So if you want to ensure cyber safety and cyber peace, you cannot neglect 70% of your digital country. And that's what's happening right now. Because on the one end, you have people who have a very low footprint, but create software for those 70% of the world. You have cybersecurity companies who have an ultra-secure and very small footprint as well, that provide service to both the IT community, the government, the critical infrastructure, and the private sector. Then you have the critical infrastructure, and all of them mixed together compose the digital landscape that needs to be peaceful in a way if we want those constituents of us to eventually feel safe, so they reach happiness, and we have a stable and growing economy.
Thanks for outlining, because I think that's a critical thing to underline over again, that we usually think about bringing in the whole dialogue the IT companies, and it's much broader. And when we met in Berlin a couple of days ago, last week, there were companies which are from the insurance to other sites which absolutely understand that they have to be in the dialogue as well. Now, one thing is, of course, how do we make a rather closed security setting, traditionally closed security setting? We'll get back to that. But before that, question for you is, if you look at this variety of companies, variety of private sector actors, what might be their benefit to being in such a process? Now, one thing is, we usually say the companies need some sort of a profit in order to be involved in processes which inevitably drain resources and time. And then I think it was Jan-Lorenz or someone who said at the Geneva workshop, okay, it's not only about profit, it's also about benefits. So there are other benefits that companies can have. For the IT industry, cybersecurity or not, it might be more clear what the benefits are. But I would like to hear from you also what you think. But then particularly for those other companies, how do we make them see, or what are the benefits they should see to be in this sort of a dialogue which seems so distant from what they do?
Yeah, I think we also, again, we need to look at the question from the angle of the four groups, actually. If we think about cybersecurity company, honestly, the driver would be, other than philosophically speaking, a safer world, the driver will remain profit. In the sense that, not that they need to make huge profit, but again, other than the general philosophical standpoint, there's no other reason why you would actually create a solution to make more security. Okay? If you look at it from an IT community perspective, it's totally different, because in the IT community, right now, they have basically, they are already dominant, and they are almost reaching, I wouldn't say 100% of the potential clientele, but almost in all the modern economy. The challenge for them is to be able to capture the nascent economy or the emerging economies, or some economies like China, for example. Those untapped markets represent their path to growth. And to be able to become meaningful in those regions, you need to be more than being about profit. I remember of my experience when I was basically working a lot in the Caribbean a decade ago. And it was so funny, because when I came there, most of the time I had to say I'm Canadian, I'm not American. Because they, unfortunately, generally speaking, they prefer Canadian to Americans. And this is not a critique at all, it's just a reality. The fact is that most American companies are measured on a quarterly basis, for example. And hence, there is always this pressure to perform and to make things move fast. But what is one of the primary characteristics of any island life? It's a different time scales. I mean, they're not in the same hurry as most people, unless there is a storm coming up. Generally speaking, the beat of life on the island is slower than on the mainland. This is, again, this is just an observation, it's not a critic. Hence, when you have those two perspectives colliding, somebody who come with a high economic incentive come in the picture of somebody who was more thinking about his island, the place he was born, the small paradise he appreciates, and he wants to preserve it. And yes, he understands he has to trade off with tourism to bring money to the island and so on. But then when you get another company coming in trying to force their will on them to extract money as quickly as possible, it contradicts their purchasing behavior. So when you think about it, moving into emerging economy is roughly the same. Nobody wants a European or an American techno-colonialist come in and force its will on the technology landscape on them. And so making software more secure, creating software that enable digital transformation helps those society to potentially leap forward from an economic standpoint, because they've been left behind in the classical economy due to what happened over the past 200 years, basically. But now with technology, the pace of change and the balance of power is so different that they can actually leap forward and basically get back a seat at the table if they are able to adopt those technology and start leveraging them. It's really a lever effect. So I think building more security and getting more involved, socially speaking, for IT, general IT company is of great benefit, especially in the emerging economies. Because again, it's an untapped market. That's the only way to grow. If you already have 100% market penetration in, let's say, North America and Europe, how do you grow your business? Everybody's going to start to hate you on the stock market, right? So you need to be able to grow in those regions. Then the critical infrastructure provider, there's a clear tension between the fact that they are for-profit organization, but they are part of the national security apparatus. They have tons of rules to respect, but they also have rules where they cannot invoice as much as they want for the service they guarantee to provide over the next few years. When somebody in the government decides to create basically a public-private partnership to outsource, I don't know, nuclear energy creation or the operation of an airport, the government is careful enough to ensure that this service will remain accessible at a reasonable price for its population for the next few decades. So they impose a certain maximum of profitability. On the other end, they cannot start imposing new rules and new security measures without permitting those companies to again make a profit. So there's always this tension between profitability and service delivery. So I think much like the cybersecurity industry, the critical infrastructure are between a rock and a hard place. It goes back to profitability, not necessarily benefit, because the benefit pricing is capped. There is no reason to generate more value for them because it goes off their balance sheet. And then you have the other sector. And the other sector is probably in the same spot as the IT community. If you think about it, if you provide insurance services or pharmaceutical product, if you're successful, you've dominated your regional market. So what do you want to do? You want to grow in other regions. So how do you contribute to those economies so they adopt you as somebody who's investing in their local economy? And I think that providing a safer cyberspace, a safer cyber experience to their customership, generally speaking, will position them with an advantage against those who do not, or some of the local players who don't have the experience, the capability, or the will to provide the same level of security.
Thanks firstly for bringing in for being honest, that it boils down to profit at the end. And I recently had a good discussion with a company which is a producer of the medical equipment, and they're thinking about their future markets in the IoT very likely, but they haven't been thinking about the security issues. And they started thinking about that, and now they basically started inquiring themselves, what should they do? Should they be in some sort of a cybersecurity alliances? Should they be, what is their competition doing in this field and so on? So there is increasing interest in that. And secondly, because you mentioned the local context and the local, the values, the cultural context, which is, I think, quite important. Sometimes we get locked into the Western mindset, but it's quite different if you go to Africa, if you go to Caribbean, if you go to Pacific Islands, Southeastern Asia. There are completely different mindsets and cultural values, so that's quite important. There is an interesting question which comes from Teresa, saying, how would you bring in the aspect of size or dominance of a company in being socially responsible and contributing towards safer cyberspace? To what extent resources maturity relate with responsibility expectations? So to what extent we can expect the bigger, the dominant companies to be more responsible, or should also the smaller ones be equally? Is there any sort of a correlation?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because if you step back and you start thinking about it, those large companies, by definition, and as a result of their maturity, generally speaking, are more secure. So it's not about them being more secure, it's how can they enable their customers to be more secure. Is that a question of social responsibility? Well, in the world of software and IT infrastructure, I wouldn't say so, because it's a choice you make to adopt those technology. It's not something you need to live. It's not like some medication. It's not on the same, to me, it's not the same scale of criticality as healthcare would be, for example, or access to food and clean water and so on. So I think recognizing that there's a slightly different dimension is important, because it positioned the debate at in a different place as well. You cannot go crazy against a Google or a Microsoft because they're successful. I mean, they just did their job better than somebody else. Do we hear people screaming at international law firm or accounting firms because they are making billions per year and they are being globally successful? No. I mean, I rarely heard somebody, other than right after Enron, I've rarely heard somebody scream at PwC or KPMG or Deloitte or, those big accounting firms for being too big and too profitable. Why do we do that to Google? Why do we do that to Microsoft or to Amazon? What is the basis of that? That's what I don't get. I'm not saying I have a good answer, but I think it's a good question that we should all ask ourselves, because the same exists. Do we scream at Shell for dominating the petroleum industry, or BP, for example? I think the only time we scream at them is actually when they make an ecological disaster, which is totally normal. I would expect everybody to go after Microsoft if they would create an ecological disaster. So right now, what people worry about is, or my interpretation is that a lot of people worry that those large tech companies will actually get in their mind and start influencing them. As an IT scientist, I can say that I never saw somebody, uber evil, who's thinking of, can I predict what somebody will buy? Can I influence that? What we like is the algorithm works. It's nothing personal. Now, people do evil things with our creation. That's for sure. That's Cambridge Analytica. Okay? So is it the fault of Facebook of being or having access to this data? Yes, we can say they were not as diligent or as protective as they should have been with this data. But step back, 4 years ago, there were no clear rules in Europe or in America that govern the use of those data. So we are attacking them on ethical and moral grounds on something that is actually not endangering the planet, not killing people, versus what we see in other industry, like the chemical industry or even some pharmaceutical industry. I've seen no later than 2 weeks ago that a company is now marketing a treatment that basically, I don't remember exactly what's the condition, but if you have this condition, you're 100% guaranteed to go blind. They found a treatment, single shot. You will not go blind if you get that treatment. The treatment is now for sale at $4.5 million. So Is your site valued at $4.5 million? I can bet you that they did all the psychological study to do it. Is that responsible? Is that ethical? Why would IT company deserve a special treatment when they are not endangering life right now? They're not. Some might say that they are endangering sometimes democracy. On the other hand, e-voting exists in Switzerland, and I can attest that it's almost bulletproof. I can also attest that the e-voting and the votes that were manipulated in the United States, the technology that they're using is weak. The technology they chose not to update was obtained at the lowest price. So people like to get things on the cheap, but definitely don't like to bear the consequences if something goes wrong. And that's why I think there's a huge disconnect between IT and reality.
That's an important part, which is, I think, also maybe not subject for this discussion. It was somewhat in the previous webinar. What is the role? What is our responsibility as people, as users, consumers, to actually demand more secure, more privacy protected, rather than just cheaper? Teresa basically explained a bit more her thought, which was not necessarily linked just to cybersecurity, but generally the interest or responsibility to get hands-on governance of cyberspace, and whether in that sense we can expect bigger companies to have more capacity to deal with that. And Ginger posted an interesting comment that small companies might be more consumer conscious and might take these choices to favor for their customers rather than the big ones. That's an interesting question. But then Ahmed actually pushed the discussion in the direction that I wanted to also check with you now. Let's say that to some extent we do have, at least when it comes to security, and back to the topic, security and international peace and security and cyberspace, let's say that we do have increasing interest by at least the giants like Microsoft, which seems to be the leader in some fields, the Tech Accord and the Paris Call and so on. And then we see some sort of a response by a number of companies which have signed the Tech Accord or the Paris Call and so on. And by the way, we've just published a blog on the Paris Call. If someone wants to learn more, you can find it on Article as well. So Ahmed's question is, do we have a world level vision, strategy, accord, how to integrate big ICT companies primarily, and then of course others, researchers, civil society and governments, to promote digital peace and in this context of cybersecurity? So to what extent we can expect, and we are seeing some sort of a self-organizing of the private sector to drive more towards secure cyberspace, and maybe even to push the global policies as well, and the governments to be more responsible. What's your impression?
I will say something probably that is pretty controversial, as I like to do on a regular basis. People expect things to run in cyberspace in the same fashion as they run in the real world. On the other hand, people want to preserve net neutrality. If you want the internet to remain neutral, if you want to remove any form of boundaries, you need also to appreciate what you're leaving on the table. And right now, there is this tension between privacy, free speech, and expectation of security and safety, and also the role of government and the role of big companies. On the one hand, the large companies, for sure, will always lobby for net neutrality. Most government will support net neutrality, and let me say something big here, probably because some of the contribution from those private actors to their own campaign. Most government, if you actually talk to the national security apparatus, would say that net neutrality is the worst thing, because you don't have boundaries, you don't have frontier you can actually protect, you don't have controls, so to impose rules on safe product before they actually come in your country. Why in the classical world we control medication, we control goods and services, electrical product, nuclear material in a certain way, so to protect the integrity of our nations, why do we try to go the totally opposite way in cyberspace? So again, if you look at it, there is this tension between the citizen who wants free speech, who wants, but also wants a safe cyberspace. He wants privacy. On the other hand, he wants everything to be open. He's not willing to get controlled in any way. But guess what? The only way to achieve a certain level of security is by providing a certain level of control. And without digging into this question, you cannot actually address the other debate, which is the tension between the government, who support, let's say, the various lobbies of net neutrality, and the private sector, who basically want that, the bigger player of the private sector, who wants to keep that net neutrality so they can actually control it completely. So I'm not being conspirationist here. I'm just very factual. No government official I've discussed with in the national security apparatus thinks that net neutrality is a good thing. It's a question I often ask. And they always go to the fact, back to the fact that people want to be safe, but they don't want me to carry a gun. They don't want to have offensive operation. They don't want to endanger critical infrastructure from another country as a deterrence. They don't want me to stockpile vulnerability as a deterrence. So they are imposing all those rules that we would never accept to be imposed on us in the classical world. So this overall debate is contentious for sure, and until people either accept that, either we copy our reference model from the physical world in cyberspace, or we reject it and we change completely our expectation as well, only then we would be able to have, in my view, a constructive dialogue. At the moment, it's race for profit again.
Thanks for being provocative, and as I said, I was expecting a bit of philosophical approach to that as well, and I think we have a lot of material to probably continue this discussion in a different setting, which is a more sort of a societal perspective. But thanks for being provocative. I think these analogies with policy areas like net neutrality, which we discussed as well heavily, are quite useful. We sometimes have to look into examples from other areas. Putting us back on the track of particularly discussing the international peace and security, and back on the example of the critical infrastructure that you also touched upon in the beginning. When we talk about international peace and security generally, this is sort of an arena of the governments. There is a lot of traditional approach to that. We see the security sector there, the military, and they have never been too much open to the other actors, including the private sector. Now we see the difference coming in, as you said, that the owners of the infrastructure, digital infrastructure, are by large, if not 90%, the private sector, and it's not only in the information field. If you look at the energy sector now, more and more we have private sector stepping in and so on. So there seems to be an understanding, at least from what I could see, and we could see also in the GGE and the OSCE confidence building measures, where there's more and more reference to the role of the private sector. But then the question is, what should be that role? And when we go into that, then there is a lot of different opinions. One of those related to critical infrastructure protection is that, and that's dominantly a position of the governments, which we saw also during the workshop in Geneva, is that the protection of the critical infrastructure, regardless who owns it, is the responsibility of the governments. So ultimately, they're the ones who are responsible to the nationals for protecting their own critical infrastructure. In practice, it might not be that easy, right? Yeah. If we look at the GGE report from 2015, there are three particular norms which are related to the critical infrastructure. One is not attacking critical infrastructure of the other states. The other one is protecting own infrastructure. And the third one is assisting in critical infrastructure protection across the countries, regardless of sovereignty. None of those seem clearly involving the private sector. But I'm sure there are a lot of roles that the private sector can play there. Can you look into the possible roles when it comes to critical infrastructure from policy shaping perspective, operational development and prevention and maybe response, capacity building, whatever sort of roles you might think that the private sector can play, probably looking through the different components or different types of private sector that you outlined at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with you. At one point in time, we also need to step back and probably separate or clarify what critical infrastructure is. The Americas, generally speaking, Canada and the United States versus Europe have a different definition of what critical infrastructure is. Democracy is considered as critical infrastructure in America, and it's not in Europe. On the other hand, if you think about it, I tend to agree that for the energy sector, due to the presence of potentially nuclear material and gas and basic human care, this particular industry, energy, probably healthcare, food supply, those should be probably assisted more by the government than some other sectors. The other sectors that are considered part of critical infrastructure are, for example, telecommunication and banking. But those are international mega conglomerates. And some of them are more important in terms of revenue outside of their own country. So how would you decide which government should support what? Effectively, those organizations exist without boundaries. They don't isolate their information system. So let's say I'm a large European bank with presence in originally from Luxembourg, with an important footprint in France and branches in Switzerland. Who should be protecting the financial service institution? And what part? And what if there are tensions on the physical level between those three countries? Shall I allow them to intervene and potentially attack the other country through this transnational channel? That's what, again, I think people fail to recognize that from a cyber perspective, we don't have those physical boundaries, not that simple. So in some sector, it's much easier than in others. Energy tends to be regional. It might be a European-wide consortium, or it might be a series of countries that are collaborating together. But whether it's food or gas for heating or water production, those are basic human care. Now, telecommunication, banking, still part and very critical to the economy and the stability of the nation, but it's not basic human right in the sense. And it becomes very complicated for a government due to the transnational nation of those organizations to really get involved effectively. So I think what must happen for sure is that those organizations recognize that limit and decide to open the dialogue with those governments to meet with their expectation. That's, I would say, banking and telecom, obviously. And the other group should be slightly different. It can be a European collaboration. It can be only at the national level, but they should actually expect support and coordination from the government. When I look at Switzerland, we know we have 26 cantons. It's very complicated because most of those cantons actually have their own state energy company. So how do you protect? Do you engage with 26 different companies? We need some level of coordination as well. So I think the answer is not clear-cut. It's not that simple. There is most definitely some companies or a subgroup of the critical infrastructure that must be both coordinated and supported by the government, and there must be another sector where government should, let's say, state their wishes, and there should be an engagement from those critical service providers to meet with those wishes. But I don't think we can manage the critical infrastructure sector as a single group. It's not that simple.
One good example probably of that is is the submarine cables, the backbone, basically,
Yeah.
where you have the outage, as we had a number of times in the Egyptian region and so on. And the cut could be somewhere in the international seas, but it impacts the regions, and then it's a conglomerate who is actually responsible. The question is, you clearly say that it's quite tough for the governments. If they have good relations, it might be easy for those that are impacted, but it's usually the impact could be a huge region, and then it might be political tensions and problems in communications. But can we then expect, and can we rely in a way on the private sector, on this conglomerate? Of course, they might have a profit in establishing the link again, but at some point they might just lose the interest in that, especially if the cable goes for, I don't know, Pacific Islands or whatever, where they don't have a lot of clients, there is not a specific profit. Can we expect the private sector, or even, you know, make them liable for being responsible for the infrastructure? Is it something that we can look at?
I don't think they will be self-responsible, or they will accept this responsibility. A good analogy is just global pollution. At one point in time, not only regional government had to put in place specific legislation to force their national or the national organization that were creating a lot of pollution to actually reduce that, to a point where we understood it was a global problem, and that alliances start happening on a global basis. But it's a process, although quite visible in terms of human impact, but also it was visually, you were able to see the effect of pollution. It still took society 35, 40 years to actually start working together to kind of fix the situation. And it took a huge amount, in my view, a huge amount of political courage for those in power to decide and put those laws in place and reinforce them. Because ultimately, a campaign is not made out of your own pocket money when you think about it. So it's I think we have a similar tension in cyberspace. I think what we're experiencing is we're experiencing two things, or two analogies. One is Wild Wild West, where there are no rules. You are basically on your own to defend yourself most of the time. And if you're a government, you're just a bigger guy on the block. But you're still alone in your bubble to defend yourself, and you can get shot from anywhere. Okay? It's not like, it's not even line of sight. It can from anywhere. So that's one analogy that we have to deal with. And it took a while, and it took society, we needed to go through, let's say, the privatization of security for a while to demonstrate the benefit before public safety became a nationalized service. Think about it. Pinkerton. I mean, there were no police forces before. Police forces is a very recent concept. Security was privatized. Up to a point, it becomes so omnipresent and so big in the end of the private sector that it became a national interest to renationalize this industry, and it's our modern state police. So that's one analogy that we should think about when we think cyberspace and how we're going to police and protect this environment. And as I said, the other analogy is more the one of pollution. The environment is very polluted. Those who are polluting more have no consequences. In terms of pollution, we're talking fake news, we're talking hacking, we're talking all sorts of ransomware, all sorts of attacks, spamming, all those things, they're just pollutions.
Are you also talking about vulnerabilities?
Well, vulnerability is one thing. I mean, again, as in the real world, you are accountable to make sure you lock your house or you lock your car or you protect your money. I think people need to patch their system. So yes, there are vulnerabilities, but the fact is that most of the time the patch are timely available by the big vendors and people don't apply the patch. That's why the attack are succeeding. And this is a reality. If you actually look, I have very few, well, actually I say very few not to be, not to use big numbers, but basically I don't remember of any of my clients at Kudelski who were impacted by WannaCry, like 0. Why? And we're talking millions of computers that in the various companies we're working with. None of them were affected by WannaCry. Why? Because when it happened, we actually informed them, explained what was the risk, provide them with the information, and believe me, when somebody from Kudelski call your company, which is, let's say you have a client relationship, and it tells you, this one, you got no choice, you fix it, you kind of listen. So those clients actually listen. None of them were affected by WannaCry. 2 months later, so WannaCry was exploiting a vulnerability. That vulnerability was publicly available for over 2 months. So we didn't know WannaCry was coming. We just knew that there was a very severe vulnerability that needed to be taken care of, and we've insisted to all our clients that they took care of it, and they did. But when WannaCry happened, why so many companies went belly up? The patch was available. The question is, why didn't they apply the patch?
So a quick response to that, because I think it also links to the responsibilities of the private sector, not just the roles, is that the justification or the explanation when it comes to WannaCry and many other vulnerabilities is that the patching system might not be viable anymore in many cases, such as specific industry like health, which has systems on maybe even the old versions of Windows or whatever. When they patch, they need to sometimes it voids the warranty for the specific software they might have. Not all the companies, and particularly probably not SMEs, can afford the services of Kudelski or other big security companies.
I agree.
And then lastly, I mean, developing countries still have huge number of legacy software, of orphan software like Windows XP and so on. So there is a huge issue there as well. And the question back to you is actually, to what extent we should look at the responsibility of the vendors as well as part of this supply chain security, that they might need to become more responsible when it comes to having less vulnerabilities, of course.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question. How often do you change the tires of your car? On a regular basis, right? I mean, if those tires they don't have the proper tracks, you know it's dangerous to drive with those, right? And you accept the fact, it was built in your mind that those tires don't live forever, right? And that you need to change them, let's say every X thousands kilometers or every 2 years. Again, why do we think that computers should work forever, perfectly? I mean, those are consumables. When those are created, compromises are made to reach market and to meet demand at a price point that is acceptable by the consumer. Now, let me tell you, Vlad, if I'm able to sell you a set of tires that you'll never have to change for your car forever, but unfortunately the set of those tires will cost you $1 million, would you pay for it? Probably not. So people don't know that some systems are effectively bulletproof. Some systems, but they accept that a majority of consumer level quality, and they accept that at a certain price point, and they're not willing to pay. I mean, I bought a computer not long ago for like $1,200. That computer would have cost me like $15,000 just a few years back. How can I intellectually accept that this same computing power that costs me now 10 times less should be perfect? I mean, from an economic standpoint, I need to appreciate and be critic about the fact that if the price goes down, there are some compromises that are made somewhere, either in quality, either in durability, either in safety. So I do accept that in real life, right? That's why if I drive a car, it's because it's not as expensive as a tank, and I know it's not as resilient and as secure as a tank, but tanks are not legal to run on the road. Maybe I can buy some armored vehicle. Why don't I do it? Because it's too expensive, right? And I accept that. But for a computer, I'm not willing to.
The question, or we have two comments and questions over there which drive the discussion well. So there are two aspects of that. One is the relation between the private sector actors. To what extent, basically, there's, and Thomas asked that, is a global coalition of private sector actors, and I would say not just the IT industry, but global or broad industry, so sort of a coalition which would help strengthening each other and making the companies more aware and more following the best practices as a sort of a form of self-regulation. And then Didier addresses I would say the awareness and the capacities of other sectors, including the private sector, to address what you're saying. So he says, it's a bit of a provocative question, whether cybersecurity sector actually thinks about contributing to peaceful cyberspace on a long-term basis by adoption and acculturalization of others. So basically helping them being more aware, more responsible of what you said. That you can't have the tires, you simply have to pay. Right? And you have to be attuned to the possible vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So there are a lot of coalitions. I mean, people in the IT community nor people in the cybersecurity community are irresponsible. We've been debating those for the last 20 years. We haven't found a solution because ultimately to create that bulletproof system, we end up in a situation where the system is less usable to the buyer. And what do we want? We want more users. So we need to create a nice experience. So the creators need to compromise all the time as well, not to constrain the user experience. There's a whole field of IT that is actually called user experience, with thousands of people just deciding what color is best, where this button should be positioned. Okay? So there is a deep understanding of all of this. And I think the IT industry is trying to grow by reducing the overall friction of technology adoption, which forces some certain compromise. But I appreciate the fact that today we are at a place where society is becoming so dependent on IT that we should probably change a little the way we adopt, create, and promote the use of technology. But those alliances exist. Specification for ultra-secure system are available. Now, how quickly can we improve that security level? I don't have a good answer. I think some large players are doing major step forward or have been working to improve the situation. I mean, Microsoft first cyber secure coding initiative started like 15 years ago. And if I look at Microsoft product today, the amount of security defect is so small. It's incredible. If you compare that per millions of lines of codes, it has, I don't know the exact number, but it must have reduced 100-fold over the last 15 years. But the fact is that we have more IT. The attack surface is getting bigger because we are using more technology and we are offering more services. Hence, yes, there will be vulnerabilities appearing here and there. But per million lines of codes, if we look at the security quality of a modern product versus a product that was created 5 years or 10 years ago, it has increased drastically. It's just that now everybody's using technology. Technology is exposed, hence we have incidents. It's like car crash. More car on the road, more car crash.
I think you marked it well that the technology use is bigger, the complexity of the software is bigger. There is one more thing which is, and that's probably wrapping up the discussion. If we focus on this capacity, we have more and more actors which, or industries which now have to embed technology in it, whether it's the IoT or whatever, as we said, health or finance and so on, which are not car industry, which are not intrinsically IT industry, so they're not much aware. So if we say that there needs to be a more, or let's say some sort of a global partnership among the private sector to help increasing the understanding, the awareness, the capacities to deal with that, among the private sector partners, as well as the society in general, the governments and so on. Would you say that there is a huge role of the private sector, particularly, I guess, the IT, which is aware, to actually build those capacities? And what is your estimation, to what extent the other private sector can follow initiatives like Microsoft? How many of them can actually have capacity to understand what you've been speaking about and to follow and help raising capacities among others?
Yeah, I think that Microsoft, or more specifically Google, for example, should be one of the partner of choice in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, for example. Now, can Microsoft or Google play an active role in the field of medical device? I'm not sure. Their contribution and their understanding of the field is probably too far-fetched. I see for some other sectors like healthcare and medical devices that the collaboration should happen between the core business specialists who comes from the medical industry and highly specialized security firms, and them working together. It's like having a thief working with the museum curator. That's the best way to get the best plan, kind of, right? So if you get a cybersecurity expert to work alongside medical professional that explains why this device is important, how does it interact, why it needs to be updated, how frequently, they can challenge each other on a purely intellectual level, so they can better appreciate what risk they are undertaking when doing this. And from then, when you understand the risk, you can actually start managing it. And I think that subject, like I said, AI is one of those subjects where it is and will be for the foreseeable future a technology specialist field. Some people might use it for autonomous systems, for self-driving cars and so on, but ultimately it's tech for technologists. It is not used today to do, let's say, autonomous psychological diagnosis of patients. In that sense, you don't need to deal with a psychologist. You just need to make sure that the technology guys work together. But IoT is different. IoT is this kinetic relation between the cyberspace and the physical space, and the physical world specialists need to provide the IT and confront this view with the IT specialist to make that happen. So I fully agree with you. If there is one space that will drastically benefit from close collaboration, it's probably the world of IoT in the short term, because that's where people who are, I wouldn't say totally clueless, but at the very least much less informed, and they are eventually putting life at stake, whilst their initial intent was to actually improve life quality. But their lack of understanding of cybersecurity and the lack of collaboration makes it very dangerous. So I think the government, from a policy standpoint, should force this collaboration between those two parties instead of only focusing on the medical device provider. You should consider who are the cybersecurity experts who can actually work with the medical provider to ensure that this device, which is now a dual device, it's a healthcare device, but it's a cyber device, that this dual device doesn't threaten life.
It's quite an interesting finale, if we wish, the additional role of the government to actually help putting together the private sector actors, which makes sense because the industry is so wide that sometimes you have to push them to work together, and not everyone is aware. And that looks like an interesting conclusion. Thank you a lot, Martin. We come to the end of the webinar, and our hour is gone. I'm sure we can repeat that. There is a lot of other open questions that we can touch upon. I want to thank you for your time and for joining this great discussion, and everyone for joining us.
Thanks for your questions, for your moderation, and thanks for everybody for their question as well.
I got the impression that we just missed a pint of beer or a coffee and have continued chat in this manner, but we can repeat that. Thank you all for joining. Also for people on the YouTube, the recording will be available. The quick or short summary of the discussion will also be available. And then this all will feed into the final sort of the recommendations and the compendium from the project. We expect to have it somewhere in January or February. We'll let you know. And we also expect that this the Geneva Dialogue will continue. We have some solid promises and a lot of interest from all sides to continue, maybe even expand the discussions. So I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to discuss both online and in situ. Thank you again for coming, and Martin, thank you again. See you. Happy holidays, everyone.
See you around.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.